This video presentation continues the description of the ImpactECON Global Supply Chain Database. In the previous video, we illustrated the removal of a tariff on a manufactured good, German auto imports from Japan, and then illustrated the representation in a supply chain framework and contrasted it with the standard GTAP database and model. We focused on German production and trade. We saw that the impacts on German production and trade could be more naturally represented in a supply chain framework, and that the projected impacts would differ from the standard GTAP model. In this presentation, we continue with the example of increased German imports of autos from Japan, but now we consider the impacts on Japan, that is, Japanese exports of autos and motor vehicles to Germany. We also consider the Japanese supply chain in the form of Japan's demand for imported intermediate parts and components. Turning to the impacts on Japan of the earlier simulation, both the GTAP standard model and the ImpactECON Global Supply Chain Database and model suggest similar impacts on Japanese production and trade. Exports rise by a similar amount in both models, although slightly more in the ImpactECON Global Supply Chain model. And since Japanese exports have increased, Japanese production has increased. Increased production in Japan increases the need for business intermediate inputs, that is, parts in Japan. Japanese imports of motor vehicles increases, driven by the increase in the demand for intermediate parts for Japanese production. However similar the results look in this overview, the two models differ significantly in the sourcing of Japanese imports to support this increase in intermediate demand. Consider that the GTAP model at the border, no distinction is made between Japanese imports of business intermediate parts in contrast to consumer and investment motor vehicles. In the ImpactECON Global Supply Chain Model and Database, we will explicitly take into account from which countries Japan primarily sources its business intermediate parts, its capital equipment, and its final consumer goods. The remainder of this presentation explains these differences. In the standard GTAP model, we start with the Japanese exports of motor vehicles, which increased. Production in Japan increases. The increase in Japanese production requires an increase in demand for imported business intermediates in Japan, that is, parts. Since the standard GTAP model does not make any distinction between imports at the border, we have to average this increase in business intermediates with the demand for imported capital equipment and final goods. After aggregating and averaging motor vehicle import demand in Japan, Japanese demand for imports from all import sources increases by the same amount, but for any supply price effects. This is a bit puzzling, since not all of the countries ship intermediate parts to Japan in the same proportions. In the standard GTAP model, imports of motor vehicles look like this. We see that Germany is a major supplier to the Japanese market for motor vehicles. The USA is large, and Australia is a small supplier. No distinction is made of the types of goods each country supplies to Japan, be they final or intermediate goods. Looking at the ImpactECON Global Supply Chain Database, we see the same data as in the standard GTAP model in terms of the motor vehicle sector and imports. But we can now also break down Japan's motor vehicle imports by consumer. In the case of Germany, we see that the majority of Japanese imports from Germany in the motor vehicle category are final goods, autos from Germany. So although Germany is a large supplier in relation to the GTAP motor vehicle sector, they are a relatively small supplier of business intermediate parts. Looking at all the suppliers in our simulation, we see business intermediates or motor vehicle parts comprise the majority of Japanese imports from Australia. Australia supplies few final goods in the motor vehicle category. Should two countries, one that primarily ships final autos and another which ships primarily auto parts, receive the same increase in demand from increased automotive production? In the standard GTAP model, no distinction is made between the parts and final goods, and that is where the ImpactECON Global Supply Chain Model and Database distinguishes itself in contrast to the standard GTAP model. These distinctions will be important for maintaining an accurate accounting of impacts, and they will determine Japan's import demand by country. Turning to the ImpactECON Global Supply Chain Database, let's track and construct the demand for total imports of motor vehicles as it might look in the standard GTAP model. Since we do not aggregate imports at the border, we will have to construct 3 sets of demand by agent. Let's start with business intermediates. We have an increase in Japanese exports of motor vehicles to Germany. This causes an increase in Japanese production of motor vehicles. Looking at imported business intermediates, we see the direct linkage between motor vehicle production in Japan and the supplying countries of imported business intermediate goods. Each country experiences a similar increase in demand for business intermediates, approximately 0.26%. This direct linkage allows us to recognize that each country supplies business intermediates in different proportions in the GTAP motor vehicle sector. For example, 89% of Japan's imports in the GTAP motor vehicle sector from Australia are business intermediates. Looking at the remaining 2 agents, demand for final goods and capital goods increases modestly in contrast to business intermediates. It should be evident that the ImpactECON global supply chain model will provide different impacts related to the sourcing of business intermediates than the standard GTAP model. Those countries with the largest share of business intermediate imports in Japan will be impacted relatively more than countries which export final and investment goods. Now we do the same thing for consumers or final goods. Finally, we do the same calculation for capital equipment. Now let's recall the change in Japanese import demand by source, as it was solved for in the GTAP model and database. Recall the overall increase in import demand at the border was about 0.1%. As we saw earlier, each country receives a similar increase in Japanese import demand, regardless of the type of good they ship, but for any supply price effects. Here, Germany is the notable outlier, because its production of intermediate parts receives a boost to its competitiveness due to the tariff reduction on autos in Germany. If that boost was not allocated by the GTAP model, all the countries would experience a very similar increase in demand, approximately 0.1%. Comparing these results with the ImpactECON global supply chain database and model, we see that the Japanese imports of motor vehicles from Germany are reduced. We have not only removed the competitive boost from the allocation of tariff costs to German production, we have recognized that Japan imports primarily final goods, that is autos, from Germany when calculating import demand by source. We do not have a constant allocation of demand across Japanese imports. Instead, demand depends on the type of goods Japan imports from each country and the agent which increases its demand, in this case, business intermediates. The aggregation of demand from different users in the GTAP model obscures the important bilateral relationships defined by suppliers and the types of goods they ship. The ImpactECON global supply chain database and model addresses this important relationship. Why use the ImpactECON global supply chain database and model? Because it will improve your representation of supply chain dynamics, which more accurately represent real-world supply relationships. Your results will be consistent with the supply chain structure in contrast to the GTAP aggregation. Thank you for taking the time to view this video. For further information or to purchase the ImpactECON global supply chain database, please visit our website.